In this lesson, we're doing this fire tornado, but of course you can just turn off the fire and do a regular sort of smoke tornado if you would like as well. So I'm working in units, centimeters, and let's do 1 unit is 1 centimeter. Now, sometimes it can be difficult to visualize what the vertex force causing the tornado is gonna look like. So what I like to do is first is just create a PF source and let's give it a circular icon. And let's go under speed and reverse it so that the particles are going upwards. And maybe I'm only gonna give it something like 30 for the speed. And I'm gonna birth a ton more particles, so maybe let's do a rate of 300. So we have something like this, and I want them to keep emitting forever, so you can just do 999. We don't really need any rotation, so you can delete that, and we don't really need any shape, so you can delete that as well. And we need to add a force. And let's go under the forces tab and create a vortex and just drag it in the middle of our tornado here. For the forces, I'm just gonna click add and add the vortex force. And now basically seeing the particles is a cool way to visualize what the vortex force is actually gonna do. So I guess first thing we can just hit E and A and then rotate it 90 degrees so it's actually going up. And this is basically the beginning of our tornado effect. What I found through my testing is that it's good to kind of stick to the number 5. So I'm going to do axial drop 5. I'm going to do damping 5. I'm going to do orbital speed 5. Radial pull 1.5. And taper length, let's do 0. It's really fast right now, but maybe we can just set the influence to 100% instead of 1000%. And that should give us something slower and more manageable. And I also think that maybe the emitter and the vortex force are really tiny. So I'm just gonna make this sort of a lot thicker. And all right, I would say this is not too bad. You don't have to worry about what this looks like too much. It's gonna look completely different when we add the fire and smoke and everything. But really it's just a good way to see the speed and how far the particles are going. So we can see that nothing is exploding all over the place. It has pretty much the tornado shape that we want, so I can say that this is pretty good to move forward. So for now, let me hide the particle flow, and I'm gonna create some kind of a source for the fire and smoke. So let's just make a box, and we want it to be pretty decent size. So I'm gonna do maybe 1500 centimeters by 1500 centimeters, so it's 15 by 15 meters. So it's a pretty large scale tornado. Maybe we can do 2 for the length and width segment, just so we have something there. I would make it an editable polygon, select these top ones and set it to ID 5 just for fun. And then we need to go under materials and click on the diffuse map slot. And let's add a gradient and apply it to our box and say show shaded material in viewport. And I'm gonna make it radial, so then you can just copy the map and create a Phoenix source. And before we forget, let's go under the outgoing velocity modifiers and you can click instance for the map. And before we forget also, let's go down in the polygon ID and set this to 5 because we only want to emit out of the top and we only want to emit out of this white circle. For the outgoing velocity, I'm gonna do 500 centimeters, 1 for noise. We can just disable temperature and enable fuel, and therefore we can also disable smoke. And then as always, I would just create a standard Phoenix grid around our tornado base, lower the resolution a lot. As you can see, I usually like to start with 2 million total cells, and I would just do jammed on -Z. Then before we forget, let's go under output and we need to output fuel and let's output velocity. And then under dynamics, let's do 0.3 for cooling and maybe 0.1 for smoke dissipation. For the massive vorticity, you can turn large scale a bit higher up. So maybe let's do something like 0.7. And I would do PCG symmetric for the conservation and a quality of 20. And everything else can stay where it is. So I'm going over these pretty fast. We've covered all of these before, so I don't want to explain all of them all over again. But again, PC geometric is the nicest conservation. We want a good amount of vorticity to break up the smoke, and then we have just some cooling to cool down the fire as it sort of rises up in the tornado. So very simple settings. And we are doing fuel, so let's enable burning. As always, ignition temperature we can do 290 just to make sure that the fuel will burn. Energy, I'm gonna do 5. Fuel depletion, we actually want to be pretty high because as the fire rises up in the tornado, you kind of want it to die off. So we can do something like 8. Smoke threshold, I'm gonna do 5 just to reduce the amount. And propagation, we can do 1 just because we don't necessarily want the fire to be exploding into a ball. We just want it to be carried up. So I'm plugging in these numbers because I've done this effect already and I know what kind of numbers should go in there. However, by all means, feel free to experiment and get the kind of look that you're after. I'm just trying to show you the vortex force and some of these techniques that we haven't covered yet with the texture and all that. So with all of this in place, let's just run the simulation, make sure that this is working. As you hit start simulation, you're gonna get a warning that the simulation will be affected by the following forces. And it's listing the vortex 1 that we created, which is perfect. If you like to exclude any of them, you can do so in the interaction rollout. So I covered that in the early lessons. And I'm just gonna say do not show this message again and say okay. So I'm running the simulation and nothing is happening. This will often happen to you. It's just something you gotta get used to because you'll always forget to add something. So right now I forgot to add the source. So I'm just gonna make sure I add this box. So I'm running the simulation and still nothing is happening, and I found that it's because the box is way too close to the border of the grid, and so the grid is sort of ignoring it. So you just have to raise this up more into the grid, and now it should work. So let's run the sim finally and see if we get some action here. And we are finally emitting some fuel. So as always, you can just go under the preview and enable the GPU preview. And now we're getting some smoke and fire. So you have to give it a few frames before you can see what kind of effect the vortex force actually has. So just so we don't have to wait as long, I'm gonna delete this cache and let's make this grid much smaller. So let's go under grid and let's just lower the Z. And then I'm gonna enable the adaptive grid. And maybe let's do by smoke and give it a 0.01 with a 5 threshold. Alright, so I'm running the sim and the grid is rising up as the tornado is rising up. So it's actually saving us some time just like we wanted to. So I'm just gonna stop the sim and maybe let's enable some maximum expansion so it doesn't keep expanding forever. So maximum expansion enabled and let's raise it up maybe up to here. So the tornado really won't go past this red line. Now I would say that generally speaking we need to extend the timeline. So I extended mine to 300 frames and you can hit H and select the vortex force. And by default it'll turn off after 100 frames. So let's just make this 300 as well. And let's go under the shader and see what we can do about getting the fire to show up. And I would say, generally speaking, the fuel depletion is way too high. We really need the fire to go all the way up. But maybe let's just play with the curve just a little bit and boost the brightness. And then maybe we can go under the smoke color and make it more black. And maybe we can just lower the opacity of the smoke to something like, 0.25. And let's go under fuel and set the fuel depletion to maybe only something like 0.5 and see what kind of difference that'll make. Alright, so I'm running the sim and we're getting something much closer to that fire tornado look. Now I would say maybe the fuel burns for a bit too long now, so I'm gonna go back under the fuel and maybe set the fuel depletion to 2. And let's go back under the volumetric options and maybe we can lower the smoke opacity even lower just to make the fire stand out a lot more. So maybe just something like this, so 0.09. So now maybe I would just play with the curve like we're used to maybe kill off some of those brightest spots. So maybe move this back and move this back, something like this. So I'm just looking at these bright areas here. Maybe I don't want them to be quite so blown out. So maybe something along these lines. and then you can add more of that red fiery look to the fire. So I'm gonna make some of it more yellowish, some of it more orange. Maybe the lower temperatures can be a lot more red, and then you can just drag these colors around like we're used to until you get the look of the fire that you're after. And you can always play with the fire multiplier to give it an overall higher or lower brightness. Alright, so I decided to unhide the particle flow again and play with the settings for the tornado. So basically I'm just playing with the damping of the vortex force, and I'm playing with the radial pull. So you can see what kind of effect the radial pull has on the tornado sort of funnel. And I'm just kind of trying to get more of a tighter look because I feel like a lot of the smoke up top was just sort of flying everywhere. So I'm playing with these settings to get the kind of tornado look that might look a bit better. So it looks like mainly the damping percent has an effect, and I'm gonna do this one as well. And maybe let's do the radial pull. So the radial pull I think really is gonna make it tighter. So if I look at what we have, okay, that looks like a pretty nice vortex force. So I'm just gonna hide that. Actually, let's just leave it in the scene. And with these settings for the vortex force, let's run the simulation one more time. Alright, so I'm running the sim and I feel like overall we're emitting a bit too much smoke. So I'm gonna go back under fuel and set the smoke amount to maybe just something like 0.2 and set the threshold to 1. And also I feel like at this point the tornado force is not nearly strong enough. It's pretty much just rising up like regular fire. So I'm gonna stop the sim and click on the trash can. And I'm going through this process with you to show you that there is a lot of back and forth even from me. You always have to just sort of tweak the settings, run the sim, look at what it looks like, tweak the settings, do it again. That's really what this process is. So there's nothing to worry about if you don't look something that looks good on your first try. You know, just keep tweaking the settings, and eventually you're gonna get something that's much better. So I think the radial pull really is what we need to increase to get that tornado to spin. So I'm gonna set it to maybe something like 1.6, 1.7, and that should give us a stronger tornado force. Alright, so I had to keep tweaking it just a little bit more to get that vortex force to make the smoke and fire spin the way I wanted to. So you can look over here at the final settings that I did. About 19 for damping, 1.5 for radial pull, 15 for regular damping. So just took a little bit of tweaking with these settings, and then I went back and added in a bit more smoke because the smoke actually does make it look nicer as the tornado shape takes place. So I did about 0.5 for smoke amount and 0.5 for smoke threshold. So those are my final settings for now. And then I would just go back into the shader and you can play with the brightness of the fire. So maybe I would boost that a little bit and just kill off some of that bright spots over here. So maybe go way up, so maybe something like 10, and then you can lower the brightness on the bottom there. So maybe something like this, and I would introduce maybe a bit more of that red orange color in there. So this is starting to look very close to what I had over here. And then you can always just go back into the smoke and play with the smoke opacity to get a different look. So maybe I would do something along these lines, maybe 0.1. And this looks pretty good. Maybe it actually should be a little brighter down here, so I would just introduce some of the brightness back in. V-Ray plane as always, and add a standard V-Ray material. And let's just make it a little darker and apply it to our V-Ray plane. And then you can just go in through lights and make a standard V-Ray light. Maybe just so there's at least one illumination source. Maybe let's give it 2 for the multiplier options, make it invisible, and raise it up like this. And we can make this box, go to object properties, make it not renderable, and put our tornado in place. And maybe I would just increase the illumination onto the floor. So I would just go into the power on scene and set that to 5. And let's run a test render. Alright, so this is what it looks like when it's rendered. I'm happy with it. As always, the project file is under the video. Hope you guys learned a thing or two, and I'll see you in the next lesson.